The city lights of London stretched out like a blanket of stars below. But Damien Rockford, seated in his penthouse office, barely noticed. He leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes blankly staring at the skyline. At 40, he had everything: money, power, influence. Yet, he felt nothing. Damien's life had become a repetitive cycle of boardrooms, business deals, and fleeting encounters with women who were always seeking something: status, money, access. He found no desire in them. For years, his body had remained still, as cold and lifeless as his fortune. He had long stopped searching for anything deeper. Then there was Clara Moore, his secretary. She wasn't like the women in his world. She was unremarkable in a way that both intrigued and frustrated him. Simple, efficient, and quietly competent, Clara stood in stark contrast to the glamorous women who fluttered in and out of his life. And yet, every time she entered his office, something stirred inside him, an unexpected heat, a longing he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't explain it. He had never been drawn to anyone like this, not in all his years of indulgence. But Clara was different. She was ordinary, almost invisible in her professional attire, but Damien found himself unable to look away. He tried to ignore it, chalk it up to stress, but the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger the pull became. Something about Clara was so captivating, and it unsettled him. He tried to push it down. He was the CEO of Rockford Enterprises, not a lovesick teenager. But no matter how many times he told himself to focus, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. That night, as London's skyline twinkled outside his windows, Damien paced his office. The city below seemed still, but his mind was a storm of confusion. He had everything, and yet none of it mattered. Not until he saw her. His office door creaked open, and there she was, Clara. Her soft footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Damien's pulse quickened. His heart, once numb, beat faster. It wasn't just her presence, it was something more. Something he couldn't understand. Clara, in her simple dress and glasses, caught his eye. She paused for a moment, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He struggled to keep his usual composure, but his cool exterior faltered. "Clara," he said, his voice deeper than he intended. "Could you stay for a moment?" The air between them thickened. Clara turned back, her eyes wide with uncertainty. For the first time in years, Damien felt something stir. A desire he couldn't escape. As Clara lingered in the doorway, Damien's thoughts swirled like a whirlwind. He knew that what he was feeling was wrong. He had spent a lifetime carefully maintaining control over his emotions, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But Clara was different. She had pierced through his defenses in a way that no one else had. In that moment, Damien knew one thing. His life, as he knew it, was about to change. Everything he had built, all the walls he had constructed around himself, were crumbling thanks to her. Clara stood there, still unsure, and Damien realized that for the first time in years, he was no longer in control. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter their role. If you don't, well, you're siding with the manipulators, and that's not the side you want to be on. His usual poise, the mask of the ruthless billionaire CEO, was slipping away. There was a storm brewing inside him, one he couldn't control, let alone silence. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain composure in every situation, to command the room, and to manipulate the world around him. But now, with Clara standing in front of him, vulnerable, unaware of the effect she had on him, he felt exposed. Her wide eyes seemed to search his face for answers, but Damien had none. He wasn't prepared for this. How could he be? For years he had surrounded himself with shallow distractions, glamorous women who only desired his wealth, business deals that filled the emptiness temporarily. But Clara, she was different, and that terrified him. "Clara!" His voice faltered as he spoke her name, and he immediately cursed himself for sounding so human. She blinked at him, her posture stiffening ever so slightly. "Mr. Rockford," she said, her voice professional but tinged with uncertainty. "Is everything all right?" Damien swallowed, the words catching in his throat. He should say something, dismiss her, regain control, but he couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from her. The way her soft brown hair framed her face, the way her glasses slid down her nose as she shifted nervously. The tension in the air thickened, and he could almost hear his heart beating louder with every second that passed. Yes, he said, his voice rough. "I just needed a moment." Clara's eyes flicked to the clock behind him, then back to his face, waiting for him to continue. She shifted from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was unfolding. Damien watched her, his gaze lingering longer than he should have. For a moment, everything felt still. The faint hum of the city outside, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the even rhythm of Clara's breath, it all blurred into a distant background as Damien focused entirely on her. Her eyes darted to the floor, a small flush creeping up her neck. No. Damien interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended, and he winced inwardly. "Don't go." Her gaze flicked back up to meet his, and for a split second, he saw something there, a hint of curiosity, a glimmer of understanding, as though she knew something was happening that neither of them could explain. She didn't move. Neither of them did. Time seemed to stretch between them, the space growing smaller with every passing second. And then, just as quickly as it came, the moment ended. Damien stepped back, breaking the intense gaze between them. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the air of command that had once been second nature to him. "I should get back to work," he said, but the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. Clara nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "Of course, Mr. Rockford." She turned to leave, but Damien couldn't help himself. His hand shot out, gripping her arm gently but firmly enough to stop her. "Clara," he began, his voice softening, his grip loosening. "Please, just stay." Clara looked at him, her brow furrowing. There was no confusion in her gaze this time, just wariness and something else. Something Damien couldn't quite decipher. Her lips parted, as though she might say something, but she hesitated. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll stay, Mr. Rockford, but only if you promise me one thing." Damien arched an eyebrow. "What's that?" She glanced down at her shoes, then back up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you won't make this any more complicated than it already is." His heart stuttered at her words. The simplicity of her request, her unspoken fear, cut through the layers of control he had spent years building. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't looking for power, fame, or fortune. She just wanted simplicity. She wanted clarity, and Damien wasn't sure if he could give her that. He exhaled, rubbing his hand over his face. "I'm not sure I can promise that," he admitted, his voice rough. Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything else. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes still holding his. "Then I'll go. But if you change your mind..." She trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Damien watched her, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. It wasn't just the tension between them that was making this moment difficult. It was the truth she'd spoken, the truth he had been avoiding. He didn't want to make this complicated. He didn't want to fall into something that would ruin everything he had spent years building. But every part of him, the part that had been numb for so long, was telling him to reach out, to pull her back, to give in to whatever this was between them. "Clara," he said softly, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. He wasn't sure what he was about to say, but he knew he needed to say it. I don't know what this is." Her gaze softened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she nodded, the unspoken understanding passing between them. With a final look, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Damien to face the storm inside him. The next few days felt like a blur. Damien couldn't concentrate. His meetings, his calls, his endless to-do lists, they all seemed distant, irrelevant. His mind kept drifting back to Clara, to that brief moment when their worlds collided, to the way her eyes held his with an unspoken question. He found himself watching for her at every turn, in the elevator, at the coffee machine, across the office space. He couldn't escape the pull she had on him. It wasn't just her looks, her intelligence, or her quiet competence. It was something deeper, something that threatened to unravel the calm, controlled existence he had so carefully curated. And each time he saw her, he felt that familiar stirring in his chest, a heat that seemed to burn away the apathy he had worn for so long. It was confusing, maddening even, but there was no denying it. His body reacted to her in ways it never had before. But Damien knew better than to act on impulse. He couldn't afford to let anything disrupt the delicate balance he had built. He was the CEO of Rockford Enterprises, after all. The world respected him for his calculated decisions and ruthless control. Still, every time Clara entered the room, it felt like his entire world shifted. Clara, too, was struggling. She tried to push the thoughts of Damien out of her mind, but it was impossible. She had always been a professional, nothing more, nothing less. But now, everything felt different. She could sense Damien's gaze on her, could feel the weight of his attention every time he walked past her desk. At first, she thought she was imagining it. She had always been careful to keep her emotions in check, to avoid getting involved in any office drama. But this wasn't something she could simply ignore. Every time he spoke to her, every time their hands brushed as he handed her a file or signed a document, it felt like a spark ignited in her chest. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. She didn't know what Damien wanted from her, or if he even wanted anything at all, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to unfold between them, and that scared her more than anything. It was during one of their routine meetings that things finally came to a head. Clara was in the room, taking notes as Damien reviewed the latest financial reports with his team. As usual, his attention was focused, sharp, calculating, but then, for a split second, his gaze flicked to Clara. She wasn't doing anything different, just writing notes, like always. But in that moment, their eyes met, and something shifted. Damien's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time he felt his control slip. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had come, but it was enough to break the careful barrier he had placed around his emotions. The meeting ended, and everyone filtered out of the room, but Damien stayed behind. He needed a moment to gather his thoughts, to try and make sense of the chaos inside him. And then Clara walked in. "Mr. Rockford?" Clara's voice was tentative as she stepped into the room, her eyes searching his face. Damien looked up, his chest tightening. He knew this was the moment where everything could change. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Damien's thoughts continued to linger on Clara long after she left his office. The fleeting moment when their eyes locked had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. For days he tried to focus on his work, on the constant cycle of meetings and business deals, but his mind kept wandering back to her. Every time she entered the room, something inside him stirred. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was stunning in her own way. It wasn't the way she quietly moved through her tasks or how she handled every situation with an air of calm competence. No, it was something deeper, a connection he couldn't explain. He found himself watching her more closely, not in a way that was obvious, but in subtle moments, like when she bent down to pick up a file or when she adjusted her glasses, looking up at him with that focused intensity. Each of these moments seemed to carve away at the emotional wall Damien had spent years building. One day, as he sat in the corner of the boardroom, his attention drifted once again toward Clara. She was seated at her desk, sorting through a stack of papers. There was a quiet grace to her movements, and he couldn't help but be captivated by how effortless she made everything seem. It was as if she lived in her own world, one he wasn't a part of, yet he couldn't stop watching her. "Mr. Rockford?" A voice snapped Damien out of his thoughts. He looked up and saw his assistant standing at the door, waiting for him to acknowledge her. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a little more clipped than he intended. "You're needed in the conference room for a call," she reminded him, her voice polite but pointed. Damien nodded, shaking his head slightly to clear the fog that had descended on him. "Right, I'll be there in a moment." As he gathered his things, he glanced at Clara once more. She was still working, unaware of the effect she had on him. The strange pull he felt toward her was becoming impossible to ignore. The next day, Damien found himself walking down the hall toward Clara's office. It wasn't a planned visit, but somehow, his feet seemed to carry him there without his permission. He reached her door, knocked twice, and waited. When Clara looked up from her desk, she seemed surprised to see him standing there. "Mr. Rockford?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Is everything all right?" Damien cleared his throat, trying to push aside the sudden tightness in his chest. "I just wanted to speak with you for a moment." Clara nodded and gestured for him to enter. "Of course, sir. Please, have a seat." Damien stepped into her office, the small, cluttered space feeling even more intimate now that it was just the two of them. He didn't know what he wanted to say, but standing in front of her, he felt something shift inside him. It was like he was finally acknowledging a truth he had been running from. "I've noticed," Damien began, then hesitated, not sure how to phrase what was on his mind. "You're always so composed, Clara, so calm under pressure." Clara smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "It's part of the job, Mr. Rockford. I just do what's needed." Damien leaned against the desk, looking at her more intently now. "I don't think I've ever seen you flustered," he said, almost to himself. "Not even once." Clara seemed taken aback by his comment. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly unsure of how to respond. I suppose I try to keep it together." Damien could sense her discomfort, and for a moment he wondered if he was pushing too far. He had never been good at reading people, but Clara was different. The more he observed her, the more he realized how little he understood about her. "Tell me something, Clara," Damien said, his voice softer now. "Do you ever wonder why you're so good at this? Why you never seem to get rattled?" Clara's expression softened, but she remained quiet for a long moment. "I guess it's because I've always had to be. I never had the luxury of letting my guard down." Damien's heart clenched at her words. There was something raw in them, something vulnerable, and it struck a chord deep inside him. "Is that so?" he asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "What made you feel that way?" Clara didn't meet his gaze this time. Instead, she looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a pen in front of her. "Life doesn't wait for anyone," she said, her voice tinged with something deeper, something he couldn't place. "You learn quickly that you can't rely on others. You just have to do what needs to be done." Damien's chest tightened again. He could hear the weight of her words, the history behind them. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about Clara's past called to him. Something about her made him want to protect her, something he wasn't used to feeling for anyone. Before he could say anything more, Clara cleared her throat and stood up. "I should get back to my work," she said, her tone no longer as warm as before. Damien nodded, his thoughts racing. "Of course. I didn't mean to keep you." Clara quickly returned to her desk, gathering the papers in front of her as if the conversation had never happened. But Damien couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted between them. He wasn't sure how, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer in control. As the days went by, Clara tried to keep her interactions with Damien professional. She did her job, focused on the work at hand, and kept her emotions in check. But it was becoming harder. She could feel his eyes on her more than ever. The way his gaze lingered whenever they crossed paths, the way his tone shifted when he spoke to her. It was subtle, but it was there. and it made her nervous. She knew what was happening. She had seen it happen before. Men getting attached to her, men thinking that she was someone they could control, but this was different. Damien wasn't like the others. He wasn't chasing after her. He wasn't interested in her for any superficial reason. There was something deeper in his gaze, something she couldn't ignore. Still, Clara was determined not to read too much into it. She couldn't afford to. This was her job, her livelihood, and she refused to let anything or anyone get in the way of that. But it was becoming harder to ignore. The moments between them, those fleeting looks, the stolen glances, the subtle way he leaned closer when speaking to her, were beginning to feel like more than just a passing connection. Each time they spoke, each time their paths crossed, the air between them seemed to grow thicker, more charged. Damien knew it was only a matter of time before he crossed a line. The question was, would Clara let him? The days passed in a haze for Damien. Every moment spent in Clara's presence felt like a quiet war, the tension thick between them, unspoken yet undeniable. He couldn't focus on anything else. His usual control was slipping. His attention, once reserved for board meetings and financial projections, was now consumed by the simple yet powerful presence of Clara. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that he was overreacting, but every time their eyes met, every time she brushed past him in the hallway, the pull between them grew stronger. He was no longer able to deny it. He couldn't push her out of his mind, couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way her presence seemed to stir something inside him, something real, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. One night, as the office began to empty, Damien found himself standing alone in his corner office, staring out at the London skyline. The city, vibrant and alive below, seemed to mock him. His world, so carefully constructed, was beginning to unravel. Clara had stayed late, as she often did. She was meticulous in her work, never rushing, always putting in the extra hours. Damien couldn't help but admire her dedication. It was one of the many things that had drawn him to her, even if he refused to acknowledge it to himself. He needed a moment of clarity, needed to figure out what he was going to do about her. As the minutes dragged on, the decision became clear to him. There was no escaping this. He wanted her, needed her, in a way he couldn't explain, and for the first time in years, he didn't care about the consequences. Damien grabbed his jacket and made his way toward the exit. He had to see her. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when all he could think about was Clara. When he reached her office, the door was slightly ajar. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her sitting at her desk, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. She was reading through some documents, her brows furrowed in concentration, completely unaware of his presence. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, watching her. The desire was overwhelming, the need to be near her, to feel the warmth of her proximity, gnawing at him. Before he could stop himself, he pushed the door open. Clara looked up, her eyes widening when she saw him standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with anticipation, their unspoken feelings hanging in the room like a fragile thread. "Mr. Rockford," Clara said, her voice soft but cautious. "Is there something you need?" Damien took a deep breath, stepping into her office. The sound of his footsteps seemed louder than usual in the silence. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara nodded, standing up from her desk. She looked uncertain, her body language tense as if preparing for whatever he was about to say. "Of course," she said, her tone polite but distant. Damien didn't waste any more time. He moved closer to her, his presence filling the room, closing the distance between them. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his breath was coming in shallow bursts. "You don't have to be so formal with me, Clara," he said quietly. "We're beyond that, aren't we?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She seemed unsure of what to say, her gaze flickering between his eyes and the floor. Her body was stiff, but Damien could see the way her pulse quickened, the way her breath became more shallow. She felt it too. Damien reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of desire straight through him. He didn't know what had come over him, but in that moment, he didn't care. He had spent too many years controlling every aspect of his life, and now, with Clara standing before him, all of that control was slipping away. Without another word, he leaned in, capturing her lips with his. The kiss was hesitant at first, testing the waters, but it quickly deepened as Clara responded to him. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. There was no office, no responsibilities, no consequences, only the overwhelming feeling of being alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had always been in control, but now, with Clara in his arms, he felt out of control in the best possible way. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless. Clara's eyes were wide, and her cheeks flushed with color. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion, surprise, and something else he couldn't place. What was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Damien took a step back, his own heart racing. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Clara." Clara opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She stood there, looking at him, unsure of what to do or say. Damien could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to pull away, to shut down the emotions that had been building between them, but he knew it wasn't that simple. "Don't," he said softly, taking another step toward her. "Don't push me away." Clara didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, staring at him, her chest rising and falling with every breath she took. It was clear that she was torn. She wanted to resist, wanted to keep things professional, but there was something between them that she couldn't ignore. She started, her voice trembling. We can't." Damien placed a finger on her lips, silencing her. "We can't fight this, Clara. Not anymore." The moment he kissed her, Damien knew there was no going back. Everything was about to change. He had crossed a line he hadn't even realized he was standing on, and now there was no way to undo it. Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite read. She pulled away from him, stepping back toward her desk, her face flushed. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice shaking. "This isn't right. You're my boss. We can't do this." Damien felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He knew she was right. She had every reason to be cautious, but at that moment, he didn't care about the rules. He didn't care about the boundaries they had to maintain. All he could think about was how he felt when he kissed her, how alive she made him feel. "I know it's complicated," he said softly, his voice low, "but I can't ignore it anymore, Clara. I can't stop thinking about you." Clara shook her head, her hands trembling as she gathered her papers from the desk. "You're my boss," she repeated, more forcefully this time. "I can't cross that line." Damien stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. "Then help me understand why I can't stop thinking about you." Clara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. There was a moment of silence before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not what you think I am." Damien frowned. "What do you mean?" Clara swallowed hard. "I'm just a secretary. I don't belong in your world, Damien." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had never thought of her that way, not in the way she was presenting herself. To him, Clara was everything he had been missing, real, grounded, unpretentious. "You belong here," he said firmly, stepping closer to her again. "You belong with me." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I can't be what you want me to be," she whispered. Damien reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "You're exactly what I need, Clara." Before she could respond, the door to her office opened, and they both froze. "Mr. Rockford, It was his assistant, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Damien immediately pulled away from Clara, stepping back as his assistant looked between them. The tension in the room was palpable, and Damien knew things were about to get more complicated than he had ever imagined. The following days passed in a haze of tension. Damien couldn't escape the electric pull between him and Clara, but he tried to. He told himself he had to focus, to keep his head in the game. There was too much at stake. His empire, his reputation, everything he had built. And yet, every time he caught sight of Clara, every time their eyes met across the office, all that resolve slipped through his fingers. It wasn't just the physical attraction that weighed on him, it was the emotional pull. He was used to being in control, to keeping things compartmentalized, but Clara had become an uninvited guest in his thoughts, disrupting the careful order of his life. He wasn't sure what he wanted from her, or even if he wanted anything at all. All he knew was that he couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop the way his heart raced when she was near. For her part, Clara seemed to avoid him whenever she could. She kept their interactions brief, professional. She didn't let herself linger in his presence any longer than she had to, and Damien noticed it. Her reluctance to engage with him was like a physical wall he couldn't scale. It only fueled his desire more, though he would never admit that aloud. Clara wasn't blind to the intensity that had been building between them. She could feel it, the strange shift in the air whenever she walked into the room, the way Damien seemed to watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. It unsettled her. It wasn't that she was unwilling to admit the attraction was mutual. She just couldn't allow herself to get tangled in something so complicated. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, to risk it all for a fleeting moment of weakness. But despite her efforts to keep things professional, her mind kept drifting back to Damien, to the way his hands had felt on her skin, to the warmth of his kiss that still lingered in her memory. It was dangerous, and she knew it, but it was undeniable. It didn't take long before whispers began to spread. It started with a few curious glances from the staff, then moved on to hushed conversations in the break room. Damien and Clara weren't overt in their interactions, but there was something in the way they looked at each other. Something that couldn't be ignored. Clara tried to keep her head down, focusing on her work, but it was impossible to ignore the growing tension around her. She had never been one to care about office gossip, but this was different. She could feel the eyes of the other staff members on her whenever she entered a room, the weight of their unspoken questions making her skin crawl. She wasn't naive. She knew how it looked. The powerful CEO and his quiet secretary, their chemistry undeniable, their actions suspiciously intimate. She wasn't blind to it, but she wasn't going to acknowledge it either. Not yet. One afternoon, as she was walking to her desk, she overheard a conversation between two of the junior staff. They were whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "I saw them the other night," one of them said. "She was in his office late, and when she came out, her hair was all messy. You know what that means, right?" The other staff member giggled. "Of course. I've seen the way they look at each other. It's only a matter of time before they can't hide it anymore." Clara's heart sank. She tried to ignore their words, but they echoed in her mind as she walked away. Back in his office, Damien couldn't focus. His mind kept replaying the events of the past week. The kiss, the heated looks, the way his body had responded to Clara in ways he hadn't expected. He tried to tell himself it was just a passing thing, a momentary lapse in judgment, but deep down, he knew that was a lie. The attraction he felt for her was too real, too powerful to ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those big, wide eyes, that calm, cool demeanor that made him want to break through her walls. She was different from all the women he had ever known. He couldn't get her out of his head, and that scared him more than anything else. He paced his office, running his hands through his hair. His world had always been about control over his empire, his schedule, his emotions. But with Clara, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. He was losing himself in her, and the idea terrified him. But the more he tried to push his feelings away, the more they seemed to intensify. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop the way his heart pounded when she entered a room. He had been with countless women, but none had ever made him feel this way. Why was Clara different? What was it about her that had this hold over him? He needed answers. He needed to understand why his mind and his body reacted to her the way it did. It was late one evening when Damien found himself in the hallway outside Clara's office again. He had been waiting for a moment alone with her, waiting for the right time to confront her about everything that had been building between them. But the more he waited, the more the tension built. Clara was at her desk, as usual, working late. Damien stood outside her door, gathering the courage to enter. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending anymore. He knocked twice, the sound sharp in the silence of the late evening. Clara looked up, startled, her eyes wide as she saw him standing in the doorway. "Mr. Rockford," she said, her voice quiet but professional. "I didn't expect you here this late." "I could say the same to you," Damien replied, trying to sound casual, though his voice was anything but. Clara smiled faintly. "I like to stay on top of things. You know how it is." Damien stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their past encounters hanging between them like a fragile thread. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent, "about what happened between us." Clara looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. "Mr. Rockford, Don't," he interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "Clara, I don't know how to explain this, but I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried, believe me. I've tried, but every time I see you, everything inside me reacts, and I'm not sure what this is, but I need to know." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She looked at him, her eyes filled with conflict. "I don't think this is a good idea," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Damien stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know it's complicated," he said softly, "but I can't pretend it isn't happening. I can't pretend I don't feel this." Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with emotion. "Clara," Damien said again, his voice barely a whisper, "I want to understand this. I want to understand you." Clara looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know if I can let you in," she said quietly. Damien's heart clenched. "You don't have to decide now. But I need to know if there's a chance for us. If there's something here." Clara stood in front of him, torn between her desire to resist and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this." And with that, she turned away from him, walking toward the door. But before she could leave, Damien grabbed her arm gently, stopping her in her tracks. "You're not alone in this, Clara," he said, his voice low, full of raw emotion. "I won't let you walk away from this." Damien's words hung in the air between them, but Clara was too overwhelmed to process them properly. She could feel the heat of his hand still lingering on her arm, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the world faded away. It was just the two of them, standing in that small office, the tension between them undeniable. Every instinct she had screamed at her to pull away, to escape this moment before it consumed her. But another part of her, one that had been buried deep for so long, wanted to give in, to surrender to the pull she felt toward him. She was a professional, though. She had worked too hard to get to where she was. She couldn't let her emotions take over, not with Damien, not in this world. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Clara," Damien's voice was quiet, almost desperate. "I need to know if you feel the same way." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape from this, to forget that she had ever kissed him, that she had allowed herself to feel something for him. But there was no denying the truth anymore. She couldn't hide from it. Every time their eyes met, every time their hands brushed, she felt a fire ignite within her, a fire she wasn't ready to face. She pulled away from him slowly, stepping toward the door. She couldn't stay here, not like this. "I can't," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't right, Damien." Damien moved toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. "You're not the only one who's scared, Clara," he said softly, his voice filled with raw emotion. "But I can't keep pretending that nothing is happening between us. I don't want to hide anymore." Clara closed her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "This can't be. It's too complicated. We're in two different worlds. I'm your secretary. I'm nothing compared to you." "That's not true," Damien said, his voice firm. He reached out, gently touching her arm once again. This time, his touch was less demanding and more reassuring. "You're everything to me, Clara. Don't you see that?" Clara froze at his words. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She had never heard anyone say something like that to her, not with such conviction, such raw honesty. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. How could this be happening? How could someone like Damien Rockford, someone so powerful, so untouchable, want someone like her? A simple secretary, someone whose life was nowhere near as glamorous or grand as his. "I don't belong in your world," she said quietly, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't do this to you, to us." Damien's hand brushed her cheek gently, his thumb wiping away the tear that had escaped down her face. "Clara," he murmured softly, "you don't belong in any world but mine." She closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. She could feel his warmth, his presence, and for a moment the fear that had held her back melted away. Could she really let go of everything she had ever known, everything she had worked for him? The following morning, Clara arrived at work with a heavy heart. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with Damien the night before. It felt like everything had changed between them, like the lines had blurred in a way she couldn't undo. She couldn't explain why she hadn't just walked away from him, why she hadn't shut him down completely. But in the end, the pull was too strong. She was too close to him now. It wasn't just the kiss either. It was the things he had said to her, the way he had looked at her, as if she was the most important person in his world. And as much as she wanted to deny it, as much as she wanted to run from him, part of her wanted to believe him, part of her wanted to let him in, to let herself be vulnerable for once. But reality was a different beast, and reality came crashing down the moment she stepped into the office. The moment she entered the building, the air felt thick with tension. It didn't take long for her to realize that something had changed. The gossip was everywhere. Whispers in the hallway, sidelong glances from the staff. Everyone knew something was going on, and the rumor mill was already working overtime. Clara tried to ignore it as she made her way to her desk. But the weight of the attention was undeniable. She could feel the eyes on her, feel the subtle judgment from her colleagues. She kept her head down, trying to stay focused on her work, but it was impossible to ignore the murmurs. "Did you hear?" one of the junior staff whispered. "They say Mr. Rockford and Clara are more than just boss and secretary." The words stung, but Clara refused to acknowledge them. She couldn't. She wasn't ready to deal with what this meant. She wasn't ready to face the reality of what had happened between her and Damien, but it wasn't just the gossip that weighed on her. It was the fact that Damien had made their feelings known. He had gone public with his attraction to her, making their connection impossible to ignore. That kind of attention, especially in a corporate setting, had consequences. Clara's thoughts were interrupted when Damien walked into the office. He seemed different, more intense, more focused, but also more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting hers. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, But the moment was enough to confirm everything. The rumors were true. Everyone knew. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. People were looking at him with a mix of admiration and judgment, but Damien didn't seem to care. He had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. But Clara, she was still standing at the edge, unsure whether she was ready to dive into the deep end. As the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping away from her. The conversations, the glances, it all felt like too much. She had never been the center of attention, and she didn't want to be. She wanted to hide, to retreat to the safety of her desk and pretend that nothing had changed. But Damien wasn't going to let her do that. By mid-afternoon, he had called for a meeting, and when Clara entered the conference room, she found him standing at the head of the table, waiting for her. "Clara," he said, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that made her heart race. "We need to talk." She nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Of course, Mr. Rockford. What is it?" Damien took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know what's been happening. I know about the rumors, the gossip, but I don't care. I won't let them tear us apart." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Damien, this isn't just about us. This is bigger than that. You can't ignore the consequences." "The company. I don't care about the company right now," Damien interrupted, his voice firm. "What I care about is you, and I'm not going to stand by and let them tear you down because of what we feel." Clara shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't get it. The gossip, the rumors, they'll ruin everything. You'll lose everything." Damien stepped closer, his eyes intense. "I don't care about losing everything if it means I get to keep you." Clara looked at him, torn between the undeniable pull she felt toward him and the fear of what their connection might cost them. The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment she wasn't sure what to say. "Damien," she started, her voice shaky, but he cut her off. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said softly. "But I need you to know this. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for us. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out together." As the door to the conference room closed behind her, Clara's heart was in turmoil. She wanted to believe him, but could she? The days that followed were a blur. Every moment seemed to drag on, weighed down by the tension that had settled in the air between Clara and Damien. Despite his bold declaration in the conference room, Clara couldn't escape the nagging doubt that tugged at her heart. Damien's words, as passionate as they were, only made her more uncertain. What if this didn't end well? What if their feelings for each other led to more than just heartache and public scandal? But it was clear that Damien wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't someone who backed down easily, especially when it came to something, or someone, he wanted. Clara couldn't avoid him, and deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Every time their paths crossed, her resolve wavered. The pull between them was undeniable, and she hated herself for wanting it so badly. By Friday, Clara had reached a breaking point. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Damien's confession had rattled her, but it had also made her realize just how much she felt for him, how much she had come to care for him, even though she had tried to keep it at arm's length. It was late when Damien called for her. His voice, as usual, was calm and commanding, yet there was a certain urgency to it this time. Clara knew this conversation would be different. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she knew it would change everything. Clara arrived at his office, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen Damien across the office all week, his gaze heavy on her, but each time she had turned away, forcing herself to focus on her work. She couldn't let herself think about him too much. She couldn't let herself feel the pull of his presence, the way her body reacted when he was near. But now, as she walked into his office, the air between them felt thick with unspoken words. Damien was standing by the window, his back to her as he stared out at the London skyline. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched, as though he were wrestling with something inside himself. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. He didn't turn to face her immediately. "I've been thinking about us. About everything." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I've been thinking about it too." Damien finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for an answer. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've decided that we can't do this. We can't keep going down this road. The consequences are too much." Damien stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not asking you to keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. I'm not asking you to ignore what we feel. I'm asking you to make a choice. Do you want this? Do you want me?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him speak like this before. It was raw, desperate even, and it made her heart ache. "You can't ask me to choose," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't choose between you and my job. I can't choose between the life I've built and whatever this is." Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with frustration. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your job. I'm asking you to choose between fear and what you really want. Because if you want this, if you want us, I'll fight for you. But if you don't, if you can't make that decision, then I'll let you go." Clara's stomach dropped. "Damien, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be what you want me to be." His eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him that she hadn't noticed before. "I don't need you to be anything but yourself, Clara. That's all I've ever wanted. But I need to know if you're willing to take the risk." The weight of his words pressed down on her, and for a moment, Clara could hardly breathe. She knew what he was asking. He wasn't just asking for her to be with him. He was asking for her to give up her control, her safety, and step into something unknown. She wasn't sure if she could do that. The next day, Damien was quiet in the office. Clara could tell something had shifted in him after their conversation. He was more distant, more focused than usual, but she knew he was just as torn as she was. She didn't want to believe he would just give up on them, but the more she saw him withdraw, the more she feared that he would. Then, just before the lunch hour, the bombshell dropped. Clara had barely settled into her desk when the news broke. It was a subtle thing at first, whispers in the hallway, a few hushed exchanges between the senior staff, but soon enough, the rumor mill erupted. Damien was going to make a public statement about his feelings for her, about their connection. Clara's stomach twisted in knots. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to become the subject of office gossip, of public scrutiny. This wasn't just about her and Damien anymore. This was about the entire company, his reputation, and her own future. She found herself standing outside his office again, her hand hovering over the door handle. She didn't know what she was hoping for, whether she wanted him to pull back, to change his mind, or whether she wanted him to just take the leap and make it public. Finally, she opened the door. Damien was sitting at his desk, his face unreadable. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but determined. "Clara, we need to talk." Clara stepped inside, her heart hammering. "About what?" Damien leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "About everything. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending like I don't care. I'm going to announce to the company that we're together. It's time." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "You're really going to do this?" Damien nodded. "Yes, it's the only way forward. I'm not going to let this be a secret anymore. We can't keep pretending." Clara's head spun. This was happening, whether she was ready for it or not. The stakes were higher now. She was no longer just Damien's secretary. She was part of his world in a way she had never imagined. And with that came risks she wasn't sure she was ready to take. That evening, as Clara sat in her apartment, staring at the reflection of herself in the mirror, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't stop thinking about what Damien had said. He was taking the plunge, ready to reveal everything to the company. But was she ready for that? Was she ready to step into the unknown? She had always been cautious, calculated. She had built her career on making decisions based on logic and safety, but this was different. This wasn't just about work. This was about her heart, her emotions, her future. Could she really let herself fall for Damien, knowing how much was at stake? But in the silence of her room, one truth became undeniable. She didn't want to let him go. She wanted to be with him, despite the risks, despite the consequences. The next morning, Clara walked into the office with a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't keep running from this, from him. Damien had made his choice, and now it was time for her to make hers. As she approached his office, she paused, taking a deep breath. When the door opened, she knew what she had to do. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity, both in the office and outside of it. News of Damien's public declaration about his relationship with Clara spread like wildfire. Rumors swirled throughout the company, and the tension that had already been present in the office exploded into something much larger. Staff members, who had always respected Damien's cold, calculated persona, were now questioning his judgment. Was this some sort of power play, a public statement to make him seem more relatable? Or had he really crossed a line? Clara had expected the gossip. She had prepared herself for the whispers, the raised eyebrows, and the judgment that would come with being Damien's woman in a professional setting. But nothing could have prepared her for the avalanche of criticism that followed. The first sign of trouble came when she was called into a meeting with HR. The head of the department, a stern woman named Margaret, had never shown much interest in Clara's day-to-day work before, but now she eyed her with a cold scrutiny. "Clara, we need to address the situation," Margaret said, her tone professional, but filled with an undercurrent of something far more biting. "Your relationship with Mr. Rockford is causing quite a stir around the office. We've already received several complaints. There are concerns about favoritism, about how this might affect the company's image. This needs to be handled carefully." Clara's heart sank as she listened to Margaret's words. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "But it's not just a rumor. Damien and I are in a relationship." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pursed into a thin line. "And I'm sure that's very personal," she said, "but the company has a reputation to uphold. We need to make sure everything is transparent, that there's no appearance of impropriety. We don't want the shareholders to start asking questions, do we?" The implication was clear. If Clara and Damien weren't careful, their personal lives could end up costing both of them their jobs. Clara nodded, but the weight of it all felt suffocating. She had never thought her relationship with Damien would put them in such a precarious position. She had always known the risks of office relationships, of the way the corporate world could turn its gaze on you with judgment, but to feel it firsthand was something entirely different. Meanwhile, Damien was facing his own set of challenges. The backlash against him was even fiercer than he had anticipated. His board members were less than pleased, their disapproval echoing in every meeting. At first, they were subtle, discreet glances, thinly veiled comments. But as the days passed, their resistance became more overt. "Damien, this is not the image we've built this company on," one of the senior board members said during a meeting. "You're a public figure, and your actions reflect on all of us. You're not just a businessman anymore. You've crossed a line." Damien stood, the tension in the room palpable as he faced the council of people who had helped him build Rockford Enterprises. "This company was built on strength, on integrity," Damien replied, his voice calm but firm. "And I've always believed in being authentic. I'm not ashamed of my feelings for Clara, and I'm not going to pretend like we're anything less than we are. If the company can't handle that, then maybe we need to have a larger conversation about what we stand for." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Damien wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. Was he really willing to risk everything, the company, the empire he had built, his reputation, for a woman? Was he prepared to let Clara's love be the thing that tore down his carefully constructed world? But as he glanced at Clara across the room, her eyes filled with uncertainty, yet trust, he knew there was no turning back. He had chosen her, and whatever happened next, he would stand by that decision. In the days that followed, Clara and Damien tried to navigate the fallout from their decision to go public. The pressure from the company, from the board, from the staff, it was relentless. Every time Clara passed someone in the office, they looked at her with pity or disdain. It was impossible to ignore the shift in the office culture, the way people whispered behind closed doors. She had hoped that their relationship would bring them closer together, but instead, it seemed to be pulling them further apart. One morning, as Clara sat at her desk, her mind racing with the constant buzz of office gossip, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching her. She looked up to see Damien standing in front of her. His expression was intense, his jaw set with determination. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking. I can't let this go on. If this is what it's going to be, endless rumors, whispers behind our backs, I don't want it. I won't have you dragged down by this. We'll figure it out, but I can't just sit here and let the company tear us apart." Clara stood up, her heart racing at the urgency in his voice. "Damien, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. People are starting to talk, and the longer this goes on, the more it's going to hurt you. It's not just the gossip, it's everything else. Everything that's at stake. The company, your reputation." "I've already made my decision," Damien interrupted, his eyes unwavering. "And I'm asking you to make yours. Do you want this? Do you want to be with me, no matter what happens?" Clara swallowed hard, her chest tightening as the weight of his words hit her. She had been avoiding this question, avoiding the reality of their situation. But now, standing here in front of him, she knew there was no way to deny it, no way to avoid the truth. "Yes," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I want this. I want you." With that confession, everything changed. Damien took a step closer, his eyes softening as he reached out to take her hand. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." The reassurance in his voice, the certainty that he had in his decision to be with her, it gave Clara the strength she needed. The fear still lingered, but it was no longer as powerful as before. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. But even as they stood together, united in their decision, Clara knew the storm was far from over. The public fallout was only beginning, and the pressure would only intensify. The company would fight back, the board would demand answers, the staff would continue to gossip, but in that moment, Clara realized something. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many people stood against them, she and Damien had something worth fighting for. As Clara and Damien walked out of the office, hand in hand, a sense of calm settled over them, but as the elevator doors closed, a message appeared on Damien's phone. He looked down, his expression darkening as he read the text. "It's just the beginning," he muttered under his breath. Clara looked at him, her stomach dropping as she saw the worry on his face. "What is it?" she asked. Damien turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "The media's caught wind of it. The press is already calling." Clara's heart raced as she realized the storm they had just stepped into was only starting to brew. The days following the media frenzy were some of the hardest for Clara and Damien. The press had latched onto their relationship with an intensity that neither of them had anticipated. The headlines were relentless, filled with speculative stories about their connection, questioning everything from Damien's leadership at Rockford Enterprises to Clara's professional integrity. The media painted their story as one of scandal, with some outlets suggesting that their relationship was a calculated power move, while others framed it as a naive affair that would ultimately ruin Damien's career. Clara could hardly walk through the office without hearing a new rumor or seeing a whispered conversation cut short as she entered the room. The weight of public opinion felt suffocating, and every corner she turned, there seemed to be another obstacle in their path. The pressure from the board had grown exponentially, with demands for clarifications, written statements, and assurances that their relationship wouldn't interfere with the company's performance. Even her colleagues, who had once been polite and distant, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. But through it all, there was one constant: Damien. Despite the backlash, despite the mounting pressure from all sides, he never wavered. He stood by her, and for the first time, Clara saw a side of him that was so much more than the powerful CEO she had known. He was vulnerable, and he was fiercely protective of her. Damien had always prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life. The company, his schedule, his relationships. He had built his empire on control. But now, for the first time, he found himself in a situation where control was slipping through his fingers. The press, the board, the employees, they were all questioning his decisions, questioning his judgment. But Damien wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He called a company-wide meeting, inviting all senior staff and board members to attend. Clara had tried to stay out of the public eye, but Damien had insisted that she be there. "This is our decision," he told her, "and if we're going to face the storm, we face it together." As the meeting began, Damien stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the room. The room was filled with the familiar faces of his business partners and colleagues, but there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. Everyone was waiting for him to speak, waiting for his next move. "Thank you all for joining me today," Damien began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I know there have been a lot of questions, a lot of speculation. Some of you may not agree with the personal choices I've made, but I'm here to tell you that this relationship, my relationship with Clara, is not just personal. It's real, and I'm not going to let anything or anyone get in the way of what we have." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've built this company on the principles of integrity, strength, and transparency. And that's exactly what I'm going to continue to do. I'm not going to hide behind corporate walls or pretend like we're something we're not. Clara is not just my secretary. She's a woman I've chosen to be with, and I will not apologize for that." Damien's eyes hardened as he glanced around the room. "If any of you have a problem with that, now's the time to speak up. But know this, I'll fight for Clara, and I'll fight for what's right, no matter what it costs me." The room was silent for a long moment. Clara, standing at the side of the room, could feel the weight of the tension but also the strength in Damien's words. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't apologizing for his choices. And that made her believe for the first time that maybe they really could face the storm together. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself growing more confident. The pressure from the outside world was still there, still mounting, but Damien's unwavering support gave her strength. She began to hold her head higher when she walked through the office, no longer shrinking under the weight of the whispers. She wasn't going to hide anymore. It wasn't easy, and the constant barrage of questions, comments, and judgment still weighed heavily on her, but Clara learned to ignore the noise. She focused on her work, on what was real, on what she and Damien had built together. Their relationship wasn't just a scandal, it was a love story, and it was real. As the media slowly began to back off, the attention shifted elsewhere. People started to focus more on Damien's leadership and the success of Rockford Enterprises rather than his personal life. But there was one thing that had changed permanently. Clara and Damien were now living in the open, and that meant they had to be stronger than ever before. With the external pressure beginning to subside, Clara and Damien found a new rhythm. The office was still buzzing with the remnants of gossip, but the worst had passed. They had weathered the storm, and now it was time to rebuild, both personally and professionally. Damien's public declaration had been the turning point. It had silenced the critics and won the support of many who respected him for his defiance. He wasn't just the billionaire CEO anymore. He was a man who had risked everything for the woman he loved, and that vulnerability resonated with people. The board, despite their initial reservations, began to see the strength in Damien's choice, and the company continued to thrive under his leadership. For Clara, the journey was more internal. She had come to terms with the fact that her life would never be the same. She would never again be the unassuming secretary at the bottom of the corporate ladder. But that didn't scare her anymore. She was no longer afraid of stepping into the light. She had found her place by Damien's side, not as his secretary, but as his equal. Together, they faced the world, not as the scandalous couple everyone had once feared they would be, but as two people who had fought for their love and had come out the other side stronger than ever. Months passed, and with each day, Clara and Damien's relationship grew stronger. The initial storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. There would always be challenges from the outside world, from those who couldn't understand their bond, but they had each other, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of Damien's penthouse, watching the lights of London twinkle below them, Clara turned to him, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We made it," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Damien smiled back, his eyes soft with affection. "We made it," he agreed, "and we'll keep making it, every single day." As the night stretched on, the weight of their journey, the hardships they had faced, and the strength they had found in each other seemed to melt away. They had come through the storm, and now, together, they would face whatever the future held. And for the first time, Clara knew that whatever came next, they would be ready. Together. But as Clara settled against Damien, content in the peace they had finally found, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced down, her heart racing as she saw who it was from. An unknown number. The message was simple, but its implications were far from it. "You think you've won, but this is only the beginning. Your past will come back to haunt you." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she looked at Damien, who had noticed her sudden change in demeanor. "What's wrong?" Clara's fingers trembled as she passed him the phone. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think we're not done yet." Clara's heart raced as she stared at the cryptic message on her phone. Damien's brow furrowed as he read the words again, his fingers curling around the device. "You think you've won, but this is only the beginning. Your past will come back to haunt you." The simple words carried a weight that was anything but light. Damien's first instinct was to discard it as another empty threat from a disgruntled rival, but the way Clara's face had paled made him reconsider. There was something more to this, something personal. Clara leaned back in her chair, her fingers clenching and unclenching as she tried to steady herself. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She had thought that after everything they had been through, after surviving the media storm, the board's scrutiny, the whispers and gossip, they could finally breathe easy. But now, the shadow of something darker loomed over them. Damien set the phone down on the table, his eyes meeting Clara's with a mixture of concern and determination. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Clara shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. It's an unknown number, but it feels familiar. The way it was written, the tone. It's like someone who knows us, who knows me." Damien stood and walked to the window, his back to her as he stared out at the London skyline. The silence between them grew heavy. Clara knew Damien well enough to know that he wasn't just thinking about the threat. He was planning, strategizing. "Do you think this is about your past?" Damien finally asked, turning to face her. His expression was steely, as if he was already preparing for the worst. Clara hesitated. She hadn't told Damien much about her past, about the life she had left behind before coming to London. It wasn't something she was proud of. But now, with the words of the message hanging over them, she knew she couldn't keep hiding it from him. "Maybe," she whispered. "There are things I've been trying to forget. People I've tried to escape." Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with frustration. Clara, you don't have to tell me everything right now, but I want you to know this. Whatever your past is, whatever or whoever this is, we'll face it together. I won't let anything happen to you." Clara froze, looking up at him, her heart racing. His words, filled with so much conviction, stirred something deep within her, but even as he spoke, she couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep in her chest. What if the past she had tried to outrun was now closing in on her? Over the next few days, Damien's protective instincts kicked into high gear. He had already assigned his personal security team to look into the source of the threatening message, pulling every string at his disposal. But Clara knew the truth. They needed more than just resources. They needed answers. Her past was something she had buried deep, too deep. A life she had left behind when she moved to London, starting over in an effort to escape the mistakes and dangers of the world she had once known. But now, it seemed that world was coming back for her. It was late one night when the breakthrough came. Clara had decided to take matters into her own hands. She went through her old emails, her old contacts, anything that might give her a clue as to who was behind the message. She wasn't going to let anyone drag her back into the darkness she had left behind. Finally, she found something. A name. A name she hadn't seen in years, not since she had left that life behind. Jameson Rhodes. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of the name. Jameson was a figure from her past, someone who had once controlled her life in ways that made her shudder to think about. He had been part of the reason she left. Part of the reason she had rebuilt herself from the ground up. She had never expected to hear from him again. Clara sat back, staring at the screen in disbelief. She had been right to fear that her past might catch up with her. But now, the reality of it hit her like a tidal wave. Jameson wasn't just a part of her past. He was a threat to everything she had built. And now, he was sending messages, making it clear that he hadn't forgotten about her. She leaned forward, gripping the desk, her mind racing. She couldn't bring this to Damien. Not yet. She couldn't drag him into the mess that was her past. But she also knew that she couldn't face Jameson alone. The next morning, Clara arrived at work with a heavy heart. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with Damien the night before. It felt like everything had changed between them, like the lines had blurred in a way she couldn't undo. She couldn't explain why she wanted to hide this from him, why she wasn't ready to tell him everything about her past, but she wasn't ready to face it yet. She wasn't ready to let him into that part of her life. But it was no longer about keeping him safe from the truth. It was about letting him share the burden. She found Damien in his office, his back to her as he spoke to one of his colleagues on the phone. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he motioned for her to come in. "Clara," he said, his voice softening. "What's wrong? You look pale." Clara took a deep breath and walked toward him, the weight of what she was about to say heavy on her shoulders. "Damien, there's something I need to tell you. Something about my past. It's not easy, but you need to know." He put the phone down, focusing all his attention on her. "You can tell me anything, Clara. You know that." She nodded, her throat tight. "There's someone I've been trying to escape for years. His name is Jameson Rhodes. He's from my past, and he has a way of controlling people, manipulating them, and I think he's the one behind these messages." Damien's expression hardened. "Jameson Rhodes," he repeated. "What kind of man is he?" Clara closed her eyes. Her mind flooded with memories she had tried so hard to bury. "He's dangerous, Damien. He's not someone you want to get involved with. When I left him, I thought I was done with that life. But it seems like I was wrong." Damien stood up, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity she had never seen before. "I'm not letting him anywhere near you. We'll deal with him together." Clara shook her head. "Damien, this is my mess. I don't want to drag you into it. I don't want to bring you down with me." But Damien stepped forward, his hand resting gently on her arm. "Clara, you're not alone in this. You never were. I'm with you, no matter what. We'll face him together. I won't let you do this on your own." Clara looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let him protect her. But she also knew that the past had a way of pulling you back in, no matter how hard you tried to escape it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I don't know if I'm ready to face him." Damien cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You don't have to be ready. I'll be with you every step of the way." The next morning, Clara walked into the office with a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't keep running from him. Damien had made his choice, and now it was time for her to make hers. As she approached his office, she paused, taking a deep breath. When the door opened, she knew what she had to do. If you're rooting for Clara and Damien to face their past and move forward together, hit like to show your support. Comment below and let us know what you think Clara should do next. Should she let Damien fight by her side, or should she handle the threat alone? Let's hear your thoughts. And if you're not already part of the journey, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this story is far from over. And trust me, you'll want to see how it all unfolds. Don't let the manipulators and haters win. Stand for love, trust, and loyalty. Subscribe now and join us for the next chapter.